Hello, crafty friends. This is Anya General with Ink, Paper, Scissors. Today, I'm showing you 22 different techniques using Distress Oxide inks. Some of these techniques could be done with regular inks, but Oxides are unique inks. They're a hybrid of dye and pigment ink, meaning they react with water like regular distress inks, but also have a creamy, opaque finish that allows for smooth blending and layering. The pigment properties make them stand out on dark paper, and they allow for unique stamping and resist techniques. We'll cover all of that in today's video. Since this video is fully technique focused, I'm not sharing any cards today. Let me know in the comments if you'd like me to create a follow-up video where I actually turn these backgrounds into cards. I wanted to keep this video focused on techniques so it wouldn't be too long, but I'd love to show you how to use these in actual projects. I also want to mention that I've had my Distress Oxide ink pads for many years and I have never re-inked them. So if you notice my ink pads are a bit dry, that's why. I do have the re-inkers and need to spend some time freshening them up soon. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel, then hit that notification bell so you never miss a tutorial. Also, I've linked all the products used in today's video down below and on my website, where you can find even more details. Make sure to subscribe to my website so you get notified whenever I post new content. Now, let's jump right into our techniques. Our first technique is ink blending. I used Blueprint Sketch, worn lipstick, and Seedless preserves for a smooth ink-blended background. I started by applying Blueprint Sketch at the top, then transitioned into worn lipstick in the middle. Finally, I added Seedless preserve at the bottom and blended it into worn lipstick. Because oxides stay wet longer, they allow for a much smoother blend compared to regular distress inks or just regular dye inks. They also blend quicker because of their creaminess and thickness. One important thing to note when working with distressed oxide inks is that you should use a separate set of blending brushes specifically for them. Unlike traditional dye inks, Distress Oxides have a hybrid formulation that combines dye and pigment ink properties. This makes them creamier, more opaque, and water reactive in a unique way. Because of this difference, you don't want to use the same blending brushes for both oxides and regular inks. If you do, you risk cross-contaminating your dye ink pads with the pigment component of the oxides, which can affect how your dye inks perform. To keep everything working as intended, I recommend keeping separate brushes labeled for your oxide distress inks. I recommend keeping separate brushes labeled for your distress oxide inks. Our second technique is the direct-to-paper technique. This technique involves swiping the ink pad directly onto the cardstock for bold coverage. I'm creating several backgrounds today because I will need them for other techniques in the video. For my first background, I used Uncharted Mariner, Blueprint Sketch, and Mermaid Lagoon to drag the ink pads across the paper, creating bold streaks of color. For my second background, I used Blueprint Sketch, Mermaid Lagoon, and Salvaged Patina. After swiping, I used a blending brush to soften the harsh edges. For my third background, I applied mustard seed, ripe persimmons, and worn lipstick. Then I went in with my blending brush again to blend them together. This shows that even with the direct-to-paper application, you can still smooth out the transitions. Our third technique is stamping with oxides. Oxides stamp crisp and opaque. I used Wilted Violet with the Thankful Greenery stamp by Gina K Designs. Unlike regular dye inks, oxides sit on the surface of the paper, resulting in a bold, chalky finish. I'm using my mini Misty because my ink pads are dry and I knew I would have to stamp a couple of times to get a good impression. Our next technique is ink blending on die cuts. I had some leftover die cuts from the Flying Butterfly dies by Waffelflower on my desk, so I used them to demonstrate this technique. I'm using my Altenew sticky mat to keep my die cuts in place, and I'm ink blending Wilted Violet and Salvaged Patina onto my butterfly die cuts. This is a great way to add color to your die cuts. Look how beautiful they turned out. After blending, I sprayed a bit of sheer shimmer spray in the color Sparkle to add a beautiful shine. Our next technique is coloring with Distress Oxides. You can use your Distress Oxide inks to color your stamped images. I am taking a piece of watercolor paper and my VersaFine Clear Nocturne ink, my Mini Misty, and my Coffee Critters stamp set by Gina K. I am stamping the bear with my Nocturne ink. The ink that you stamp with has to be waterproof. Then I'm pressing Gathered Twigs, Vintage Photo, Wilted Violet, and Blueprint Sketch onto my glass mat. I'm getting some water and a paintbrush. I'm dipping my paintbrush in the water and then into my ink, and I'm using the ink to watercolor my critter. Because oxides react with water, they work beautifully as watercolors. Our next technique is Versamark stamping. You can use your Versamark ink as a resist ink with oxides. I am taking my Misty and the Winter Swirls background stamp by Hero Arts and aligning it in my Misty. I am taking an A2 panel of Neenah Classic Crest cardstock and placing it into my Misty. I put a little bit of tape runner on the back so my cardstock would not move on me. Then I ink up my stamp with Versamark ink and stamp it onto my white A2 panel. Then I start blending Uncharted Mariner, Blueprint Sketch, and Mermaid Lagoon onto the background. And look at the beautiful faint resist background you get. I sprayed the background with my shimmer spray for extra sparkle, and the results are stunning in real life. Next, we're wet stamping with oxides. This technique involves stamping in layers using water and oxide inks. I am taking the largest stamp from the Ocean Minded stamp set by Gina K Designs and placing it into my Misty. I'm using an A2 panel of Neenah Classic Crest 80-pound cardstock. Then I ink up my stamp with carved pumpkin and worn lipstick in several places. I mist it twice with water and stamp it onto my cardstock. Then I flip my A2 panel and repeat the process. Then I start drying my panel with my heat tool. We want the ink to be fully dry to be able to layer the ink. After my A2 panel is dry, I place it back in my MISTI, and this time I'm using Blueprint Sketch and Mermaid Lagoon to ink up my stamp. I spray it with water again and stamp it onto my A2 panel. I flip my panel and repeat the process. This technique gives us a soft watercolor effect with the ability to layer the colors if we dry them in between. Number 8 is the dark paper glow effect. I am using my mini MISTI and a dark purple A2 panel of cardstock. I'm using the anti-static powder on my A2 panel so I can heat emboss on it. I'm aligning my fairy stamp called Eve by Lavinia Stamps in the middle of my A2 panel. Once I have it aligned, I stamp it with Versamark ink. I use white embossing powder by Gina K Designs to heat emboss my image. Then I'm starting to blend squeezed lemonade around the lamp of the fairy. I want the lamp to exude a yellow glow. Then I'm using Lost Shadow to blend around the fairy for a soft white glow. These results would be much more dramatic on black cardstock, as the darker the cardstock, the brighter the results. But I wanted to ink blend both light and dark colors on my cardstock, so I opted for a purple piece of cardstock. I'm starting to blend Uncharted Mariner and black soot around the edges to darken the background for a dark night sky. The colors remain their shade of color, so the yellow still shows up as yellow, while the gray shows up as a soft white. The blue around the edges is still blue. And as you can see, the light oxide colors are glowing beautifully in contrast with the dark paper. Our next technique I called baby wipe stamping. I'm using one of the backgrounds that I created earlier from Blueprint Sketch, Worn Lipstick, and Seedless Preserves. I'm placing the ink-blended A2 panel into my MISTI and aligning it with the Music Madly background stamp by Gina K Designs. Then I'm rubbing a baby wipe over the stamp to give it some dampness. Then I'm stamping the stamp on my ink-blended A2 panel. This lifts the ink from the ink-blended panel and it leaves behind a soft, ghosted image. Our next technique is called water stamping. I'm using a background with Wilted Violet, Uncharted Mariner, and Blueprint Sketch, and I'm placing it into my MISTI. I am aligning the Doodle Garden background stamp over my A2 panel. Then I spray water on my background stamp and press it into the background. The water lifts the ink from my A2 panel, creating a stamped impression. Number 11 is distressed color building. This technique layers oxides to intensify color. I start with a background with Blueprint Sketch, Mermaid Lagoon, and Salvaged Patina. Then I'm aligning a background stamp over it in my Misty. I ink up my stamp with picked raspberry and stamp it onto my background. The oxide layering effect made the picked raspberry stand out despite the darker background. And the picked raspberry is true to color on the salvaged patina color or Blueprint Sketch. We are already on technique number 12, which is Distress React Stamping. I used Wilted Violet, Blueprint Sketch, and Seedless Preserves for a background. Then I inked up a stamp with Twisted Citron, spritzed it with water, and stamped it onto the background. The water caused the stamped image to react and slightly blend with the background, which is different from the previous technique. Number 13, heat embossing. After blending mustard seed, ripe persimmon, and worn lipstick onto a background and heat drying it, I'm using an anti-static powder tool and then stamping the same background stamp using Twisted Citron on the background. I used clear embossing powder and I heat set it. This creates a glossy, vibrant effect showing that oxide inks are great for heat embossing because they stay wet longer than traditional dye inks. Number 14, Stencil Distress Lifting. I used the direct-to-paper technique to apply Blueprint Sketch all over my A2 panel. I placed the Lush Leaves stencil over my background and then sprayed generously with the sheer shimmer spray in the color Sparkle. I placed a paper towel over the stencil and background to absorb the remaining dampness. Then I removed the stencil and the shimmer liquid lifted the ink where the stencil was placed, creating a beautiful sparkling design that is a bit difficult to see on camera. Number 15, Distress Lifting. This is probably one of my favorite techniques. I again used the direct-to-paper technique to put Blueprint Sketch generously onto my background. Then I use an anti-static powder on my background because we will be heat embossing. I used the Flower Garden background stamp to stamp onto the background with Versamark ink. Then I used clear embossing powder to heat set it. Then it's time to apply our technique. I'm taking a paintbrush and some clean water, and I dip my paintbrush into the water, then apply it to the images. In this case, I'm lifting the color off of all my larger leaves. I proceed to do the same with the flower buds, but after lifting the ink off, I decide to add some picked raspberry ink onto it. Then I'm doing the same with the smaller leaves. After lifting the color off, I'm adding Twisted Citron to the leaves. This is a great technique to add color to an already existing colored background. 16. Glass Mat Smooshing. I am pressing picked raspberry, Mermaid Lagoon, and Seedless preserves onto my glass mat. I spritz it generously with water and then start dipping my cardstock into it. I recommend using watercolor paper for this technique, but a regular 80-pound cardstock will hold up as well, even though it may warp more. After drying, I repeat this process with Mermaid Lagoon, Blueprint Sketch, and Wilted Violet for a layered effect. Because Distress Oxides layer beautifully when dry, this is a great technique to get some fun colored backgrounds. Ink smooshing with acetate. This technique is similar to the previous technique, but it gives you a bit more control. I press Blueprint Sketch, Wilted Violet, Carved Pumpkin, and Mermaid Lagoon onto my glass mat. Then I spritz water onto the ink. I use a piece of clear acetate, in this case the backing of one of my stamp sets, but you could also use a stamp pocket or the clear wrapping from a stamp set for this technique. I dip the acetate into the ink and then press it onto my paper. I repeat the process until I have transferred enough ink and I'm happy with the results. 18. Watercolor with Distress Oxides. For this technique, I used salvage patina, wilted violet, kitsch flamingo, and pine needles to create a soft watercolor effect. I started by spritzing my watercolor paper with water to create a damp surface which helps the oxides move more fluidly. Then I pressed each ink pad onto my glass mat, creating small puddles of color. Using a damp paintbrush, I picked up the salvaged patina first and then applied it to my paper, letting the ink naturally flow and blend. I repeated this process with wilted violet and kitsch flamingo, allowing the colors to mix slightly for a soft organic look. Since oxides have pigment properties, they create beautifully muted and chalky watercolor effects, different from traditional watercolor or dye inks. Emboss Resist. For this technique, I used carved pumpkin, picked raspberry, and wilted violet to create a vibrant background, then added an emboss resist effect using clear embossing powder. First, I ink blended carved pumpkin at the top, picked raspberry in the middle, and wilted violet at the bottom for a gradient effect. Using Versamark ink, I stamped butterflies and flowers from the Fluttering Fall and It's All By You Gina K Designs stamp sets over the blended background. I then sprinkled clear embossing powder over the stamped images and heat set it until it turned glossy. To show the emboss resist effect, I blended vintage photo and black soot over the entire panel, darkening the areas around the embossed images. Finally, I took a microfiber cloth and wiped off the excess ink from the embossed areas, revealing the vibrant color underneath. Gel press distress backgrounds. For this technique, I used Wilted Violet, salvaged patina, and Mermaid Lagoon with a 5x7 gel press to create layered ink effects. I started by pressing Wilted Violet and salvaged patina directly onto my gel press and lightly brayering to blend. Then I placed my cardstock into the gel press, gently pressing down to pick up the ink. Next, I cleaned my gel press and then applied Mermaid Lagoon to the gel press and placed the Lush Leaves stencil on top. I pressed my cardstock onto the stencil, allowing the design to transfer onto my background. To finish, I lifted the remaining ink from the gel press using a clean piece of paper, which created a secondary print with a softer, more abstract effect. 21. Stencil ink layering. This technique builds layers of color using stencils, showing how oxides stack beautifully without reactivating previous layers. I took the background I created in the previous gel press technique and placed the Glory stencil by Lavinia Stamps over it. Using a blending brush, I applied Twisted Citron over the stencil. The beauty of Oxides is that the Twisted Citron sat on top of the previous background instead of blending into it, allowing the new design to remain crisp and visible. Moving on to technique 22, Distress Impression, which is our last technique for today. For this technique, I used Uncharted Mariner, Seedless Preserves, and Wilted Violet to create a distress impression effect. This method transfers ink from one panel to another while leaving behind the embossed design. I started by applying Uncharted Mariner, Seedless Preserve, and Wilted Violet using the direct-to-paper technique. This means I swiped the ink pads directly onto my cardstock to quickly lay down a bold, saturated layer of color. Since this technique applies a lot of ink, I made sure to heat set the panel so it was completely dry before moving on. Next, I took the Winter Swirls stamp by Hero Arts and stamped it over the inked panel using Versamark ink. Then I covered the stamped design with clear embossing powder and heat set it until the powder turned glossy. You could use any embossing powder for this, but clear works well because it lets the background color shine through. Now for the transfer effect. I took a light pink cardstock panel and attached it to my inked background using a hinge made of low-tack tape. This keeps the two panels aligned. To activate the ink transfer, I lightly misted the inked background with water and ran both panels through my die cutting machine using regular plates to apply pressure. When I peeled them apart, the ink had transferred to the pink cardstock, except in the areas where the embossed powder resisted it. This created a beautiful mirrored impression of a soft, distressed effect. Now for the second version of this technique, I used an ink-blended background instead of the direct-to-paper method. I blended Uncharted Mariner, Seedless Preserve, and Wilted Violet onto my cardstock using blending brushes. This resulted in a much softer and more gradual color application compared to swiping the ink pads directly onto my cardstock. Again, I made sure to heat set the ink to ensure it was completely dry. Just like before, I used the Winter Swirls stamp by Hero Arts, stamped it with Versamark ink, and heat embossed it with clear embossing powder. This time I used light blue cardstock for the transfer. I attached the inked panel and blue cardstock together with a piece of tape to keep them aligned. After spritzing the inked background lightly with water, I placed them in my die cutting machine and ran them through to apply pressure. When I opened them up, I could see that this version had a much lighter and softer transfer because an ink-blended background doesn't hold as much ink as the direct-to-paper method. Both variations of this technique create stunning, layered impressions, and I love how the embossed powder acts as a resist to leave behind the intricate swirl designs. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into 22 Distress Oxide techniques. If you'd like me to make a part 2 where I turn these backgrounds into finished cards, or dive deeper into a specific technique that I mentioned today, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already and hit the like button if you found this helpful. Also, be sure to check my website for a full list of products and subscribe there for updates. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today and for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Happy crafting!